Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Pierce called her when she asked about the medication discrepancy on Colonel Brennan's chart. Not to her face. Never to her face. But Elena Martinez heard it anyway, the way his voice dropped when she left the trauma bay, the way the residents laughed, quick and sharp, the kind of laughter that dies the moment someone in authority walks back in. She was restocking the supply cart on the third floor of Cedar Creek Medical when one of the younger surgical residents, Dr. Kovac, mentioned it in passing. Elena didn't look up from organizing the 4 drips. Didn't flinch. Didn't acknowledge that she'd heard anything at all. Her hands kept moving with methodical precision, sliding each glass bottle into its slot on the cart, checking the expiration dates with the kind of attention most people reserved for things that actually mattered. Cedar Creek Medical stretched across 8 floors in downtown Denver, all glass and steel and the kind of architectural ambition that looked impressive in donor brochures. The hospital served 847 beds across its campus. Elena had memorized the layout in 3 weeks. Supply closets on every floor, staff staircases in the East Wing, security cameras with a 6-second gap during shift changes in the ICU, medication storage with access granted between 0600 and 2100 hours. She knew the schedules better than the people who'd worked here for 5 years. That was the job. That was always the job. The ICU wing hummed with the steady rhythm of machines keeping broken bodies alive. Ventilators wheezed their mechanical songs. Cardiac monitors beeped in patterns that meant everything to someone who'd been trained to listen. Elena pushed her cart down the hallway, her scrubs pressed sharp, her hair pulled back tight enough to give her a slight, permanent expression of alertness. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made it impossible to tell if it was 0800 or 2000. Time didn't work the same way in hospitals. Days became shifts, became sequences of vital signs and medication rounds. Room for 12 was at the end of the corridor. Colonel James Brennan occupied the bed near the window, though the blinds had been closed for the past 7 weeks. 3 months in Cedar Creek Medical. Transferred from Bagram Airfield in Afghanistan after a patrol went wrong in Paktia province. IED. Left side of his body had taken most of the shrapnel. The surgical reports documented it in clinical detail: 47 fragments, multiple lacerations to the left arm and chest wall, compound fracture of the left tibia, partial laceration of the left subclavian artery. The kind of injuries that should have meant a flag-draped casket at Arlington National Cemetery instead of a recovery bed in Denver. Elena entered the room and checked his vitals without speaking. BP 118/76. Heart rate 62, steady. O2 saturation 97%. Temperature 37.2 Celsius. All of it exactly what the chart said it should be, which was the problem. The numbers were always right. The documentation was always perfect. But the billing codes were wrong. Brennan's eyes followed her as she moved through the room. He was awake today, which was good. Some days the pain medication kept him in a twilight state where recognition didn't quite land. Today he was present. She saw his gaze track down to his left forearm, where the tattoo began just below the sleeve of his hospital gown. Elena. The letters were dark, professional work, the kind that happened in a proper tattoo shop, not some improvised setup. She'd seen the intake paperwork when it first arrived at Cedar Creek. According to his statement, he'd gotten it 3 years ago. Couldn't remember why. Said a woman named Elena had been important once, in a context he couldn't quite reconstruct. Blast trauma did that sometimes. Made some memories sharp as surgical steel and others blur into nothing. Elena finished checking his 4-drip. The solution was running clean through the line, the needle site healthy, no signs of infection or infiltration. She logged it in the chart without comment, without acknowledging his eyes on her. There was a protocol to maintain. She was just a nurse who came in, checked vitals, adjusted drips, and left. That was the uniform she wore. That was the role that kept people from looking too closely. The chart itself was the real issue. Elena had access to everyone's charts, part of her cover as a senior ICU nurse, 5 years of documented experience at St. Anthony's in Colorado Springs before Cedar Creek recruited her. The documentation was clean. What wasn't clean were the billing codes attached to Brennan's case. She'd noticed it first on a Wednesday, the kind of small discrepancy that most people wouldn't catch. Most people didn't spend 5 years as a trauma surgeon before cross-training as a nurse. Most people didn't have the training to know that the medication charge listed for 400 hours on Thursday didn't match the procedure documented in the clinical notes. The dose was too high. The frequency was too frequent. Someone was either massively overcharging for his care or someone was documenting medications that never went into his veins. Elena stepped out of the room and pushed her cart toward the medication storage on the 3rd floor. The hallway was quiet at this hour, only the distant sound of the admitting department carrying up through the stairwell. She took the east staircase, the one with the camera gap. 3 years embedded in military medicine before the Army intelligence placement had come through. 3 years where she'd learned to notice things that didn't belong. 3 years where she'd learned that sometimes the most dangerous threats came from inside the system, not outside it. The medication storage was locked with a keycard access system. Elena's badge worked, her credentials were real, her documentation was real, everything about her cover was real except for the specific reason she was in this building. Captain Elena Martinez, formerly of the 274th Forward Surgical Team, had left active duty to pursue graduate nursing school according to her official paperwork. Credible. Verifiable. The kind of transition that happened every month across the military medical community. What the paperwork didn't say was that the Army Intelligence Cyber Warfare Center had asked her to stay embedded at Cedar Creek Medical and document any financial irregularities in veteran billing practices. That was the kind of thing you didn't put on a resume. She pulled Brennan's medication record and cross-referenced it against the pharmacy dispensing logs. There. Again. A charge for 400 milliliters of 5% dextrose in water on a date that aligned with his actual for use, but the quantity was triple what the clinical notes documented. Someone was padding the numbers. Someone had the access to do it and the institutional position to never get questioned. Ms. Martinez. She didn't flinch. Her hands didn't shake. Elena just closed the medication log and turned, her face arranged in a kind of neutral expression that had become second nature. Dr. Pierce stood in the doorway of the medication storage room, his expensive watch catching the fluorescent light as he raised his arm to check the time. He had the kind of face that made people want to look away, sharp cheekbones, the precise grooming of someone who'd spent substantial money maintaining his appearance. His white coat was tailored. His stethoscope was a Littmann Cardiology for retail price $195. Everything about him announced that he was the kind of doctor who didn't get questioned. I was just verifying the dispensing records for Colonel Brennan's case, Elena said. Her voice came out measured, deferential. Routine reconciliation. That's not your responsibility. Dr. Pierce's tone carried the kind of casual dismissal that came from never having to consider someone else's perspective. He was flanked by 2 surgical residents, both of them watching him the way people watch someone who controls their future. The pharmacy handles reconciliation. Nursing verifies administration. That's the chain of command. Of course, Doctor. Elena closed the medication log and stepped back from the storage cabinet. She could see it happening in real time, the moment he noticed she'd been reviewing the records, the calculation behind his eyes. She'd learned to read that moment in combat trauma situations. That was the look that came right before someone made a decision about whether you were a threat. Brennan's case is under my direct supervision. Dr. Pierce moved into the storage room, and Elena moved out, giving him space the way prey animals gave space to predators. I'd prefer that nursing focus on patient care and not on auditing my billing practices. She didn't respond. Saying nothing was sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do, but only if you had the training to back it up. Elena did. She'd spent 3 tours in Afghanistan as a surgeon before the reassignment came through. She'd held the intestines of a 19-year-old private in her hands while someone else managed his airway. She'd called time of death on a 23-year-old lieutenant at 03 for 7 hours on a Tuesday when his bleeding wouldn't stop. Compared to that, a surgeon with a dismissive tone and a tailored coat was a manageable problem. Dr. Pierce turned to the residents. Gentlemen, this is an example of scope creep in nursing roles. When support staff start believing they have the expertise to audit physician decisions, that's when patient safety suffers. His voice had that particular quality of someone performing authority rather than possessing it. Ms. Martinez, I'm going to need you to focus on your patient care assignments. Leave the medicine to the physicians. Elena nodded. Not a nod of agreement, but a nod of acknowledgement. There was a difference. Most people didn't catch it. She turned and wheeled her supply cart back toward the elevator. Behind her, she heard Dr. Pierce's voice resume, lower now, speaking to the residents about the importance of maintaining professional boundaries. One of them laughed nervously. Elena didn't look back. Inside her jacket lining, sewn carefully into a seam that no one would ever notice during a routine locker search, was a faded unit patch from the 274th Forward Surgical Team. The patch had a medical cross on it, red and white, with a unit designation embroidered in dark thread. It was the only thing Elena carried that connected her to who she actually was. Everything else was the cover. The nursing credentials were real. The experience was real. The 5-year work history was meticulously documented. The persona of a careful, quiet nurse who kept her head down and didn't ask questions was a role she'd perfected across 3 years of Army medical service. The elevator doors opened on the 3rd floor. Elena stepped inside and pressed the button for the ICU wing. As the doors closed, she caught her reflection in the polished steel. She looked exactly like what she was supposed to look like. Competent but deferential. Professional but unremarkable. The kind of nurse that doctors forgot about the moment she left the room. The kind of person no one suspected of being anything other than exactly what she appeared to be. That was the real disguise. She had no idea that what happened next would change everything, and that the investigation she'd come to Cedar Creek Medical to conduct would be the least dangerous thing she'd encounter in Dr. Pierce's world. Dr. Pierce held up Elena's patient chart like a prosecutor presenting evidence. The Cedar Creek Medical Conference Room fell silent, 20 residents packed around the mahogany table, pens poised over notepads, waiting. Here we have a perfect example of nursing overreach, Pierce announced, flipping pages with theatrical precision. His voice carried the tone of a man explaining a child's crayon drawing to adults. Nurse Martinez flagged what she calls a medication discrepancy on Colonel Brennan's post-operative protocol. A medication discrepancy. He paused, letting the absurdity hang. Apparently her weekend certification makes her qualified to second-guess pharmacology decisions made by board-certified physicians. Laughter rippled through the residents like dominoes. 2 of them exchanged glances. One openly smirked. Elena stood against the back wall, hands clasped behind her back, spine straight as a parade ground. Her eyes fixed on a point 3 inches above Pierce's head. The only betrayal was a single twitch in her jaw muscle, the kind of micro-movement that took 3 tours and 2 combat deployments to control. Her breathing remained perfectly even. In and out. Measured. Mechanical. Perhaps Nurse Martinez missed the day in nursing school where they explained the chain of command, Pierce continued, his smile sharp enough to draw blood. Or perhaps she's auditioning for a role she's wildly unqualified to play. He set the chart down on the table with a deliberate thwop that echoed off the tile ceiling. Let's be clear about something, nurses advocate. Nurses execute. Nurses do not diagnose. Nurses do not override physician judgment. Nurses certainly do not submit formal concerns about decisions they lack the education to understand. The resident scribbled notes. One whispered something to his neighbor. Elena's pen was steady in her pocket. Her badge hung at her hip. If she was angry, the room would never know. That was the thing about combat training, it teaches you that survival sometimes means being invisible. That restraint is its own kind of power. That the person who reacts is the person who loses. Pierce gathered the chart and his notes. Class dismissed. Excellent teaching case, everyone. Remember, respect the hierarchy, or the hierarchy will disrespect you. The residents filed out, still chuckling, still scribbling, still certain they'd witnessed a justified correction of a nurse who'd forgotten her place. Elena waited until the conference room door closed before she moved. Then she turned and walked to the ICU corridor with her shoulders level and her hands steady. No one would have known she'd been just humiliated in front of 30% of the hospital's resident physician class. 2 hours later, during the 2 p.m. shift break, Elena stood at the third-floor vending machines in the break room hallway. The machine hummed its mechanical rhythm, a sound like a sedated animal. She'd been craving something simple. Protein. Carbohydrates. Fuel. 2 surgical residents rounded the corner, Dr. Chen and Dr. Patel, still riding the endorphin high from rounds, still drunk on the performance of medical authority. "Hey, it's the wannabe doctor," Chen called out, his voice pitched to carry down the empty hallway. He leaned against the wall beside her, arms crossed, the body language of a predator who'd already decided you were prey. "You gonna diagnose my Diet Coke next, Martinez? Maybe flag it for excessive carbonation? Acid reflux risk factor." Patel snorted like a hyena. "She probably wants to scrub into surgeries. Wear the big girl gloves. Maybe tell Dr. Hayes his surgical technique has room for improvement." Elena fed a dollar bill into the machine. Then another. Then another. Her hands were steady as a surgical laser. No tremor. No hesitation. The internal temperature of her body remained exactly 98.6 degrees. "What? No medical opinion to share?" Chen pressed, leaning closer, his voice dripping with false friendliness. "No groundbreaking insights about vending machine safety protocols? No concerns about the structural integrity of the snack dispensal mechanism?" The machine clicked. She selected row G7. A granola bar tumbled down and landed in the metal collection bin with a soft metallic clang. "Silent treatment," Patel announced. "That's mature. That's very mature." He turned to Chen. "She's probably going to report us for bullying. Add it to her list of concerns that no one asked for." Elena took the granola bar, turned without a word, and walked past both of them. Her footsteps were measured and calm. Each step deliberate. Her scrubs moved with the precise economy of someone who had practiced moving through hostile environments for 14 years. The color of her composure was ice water. Absolute. Unbreakable. That was the last thing either resident ever said to her face. That afternoon at 15:16, Elena was charting at the nurse's station when she saw him approaching. Dr. Pierce. He was moving with purpose, which meant someone was about to have a bad day. A security guard walked 3 steps behind him, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable. The guard was new, hadn't been hired to escort dissidents out of hospitals, probably preferred watching the ground floor entrances. "Nurse Martinez," Pierce said, his voice pitched to carry down the entire ICU corridor. Every nurse within 20 feet stopped what they were doing. "You're creating a hostile work environment." Elena set down her pen. She turned to face him. 3 seconds of eye contact. That was all she gave. Then she looked back at her charting. "I filed 3 formal complaints in 2 weeks documenting your insubordination and boundary violations." He held up a folder, thick, professionally organized, the kind of documentation that took real planning. "First complaint, inappropriate time spent with a single patient, Colonel Brennan. 23 hours in a single 7-day period. That's not care. That's obsession." The second complaint, questioning physician orders without proper channels. Submitting concerns directly to attending physicians instead of utilizing the established hierarchy. Third complaint, creating friction between nursing and surgical staff through your persistent, and let me be clear, unfounded, concerns about billing practices. The words were like precision strikes. Each one placed for maximum damage. Elena heard the other nurse's keyboard stop. She could smell the antiseptic and coffee and underneath it the faint copper of old blood on the trauma bay tiles. "Hospital policy is very clear about staff who can't respect the chain of command," Pierce continued. His voice was the voice of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. Continue this pattern and you'll be escorted from the building permanently. Effective immediately. He tapped the folder against the counter with theatrical finality. Do we understand each other? Elena met his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. Nod. One movement. Minimal. Efficient. Telling him nothing. She returned to her charting, pen moving across the page in perfectly controlled script. Each letter formed with the precision of someone transcribing testimony. The weight of his stare lasted another 30 seconds. He wanted a reaction. Anger. Tears. Desperation. Something he could use to prove she was unstable, unsuited for the work, a problem that needed solving. Instead, he got silence and steady handwriting. Fine, he said finally. We're done here. He left. The security guard followed. The nurses slowly returned to their screens, their conversations resuming at half volume, their eyes occasionally flicking toward Elena's station. Elena finished charting the afternoon medications at 16:14. Then she opened Colonel Brennan's billing file on the medication room computer, the one with the locked door and the camera that had mysteriously stopped recording 3 months ago. She photographed 7 pages of documents with a camera the size of a button sewn into the lining of her jacket. Inflated ICU monitoring charges $847 per day when the standard rate was $284. Phantom surgical time, for hours of operating room use for a procedure that lasted 90 minutes. Equipment costs for devices that never appeared on the surgical preference cards. The pattern was beautiful in its elegance. The kind of fraud that only works if you control the documentation, the billing, and the physician oversight. The kind of scheme that bleeds veteran accounts dry because government reimbursement never asks questions, not when the paper trail looks official. Not when a board-certified surgeon says the charges are legitimate. What Pierce didn't know was that Captain Elena Martinez wasn't just a nurse who'd noticed irregularities. She was Army intelligence. She'd spent 14 months preparing this insertion, assembling credentials, learning the systems. She'd been placed at Cedar Creek Medical specifically to investigate financial crimes within the veteran healthcare network. Getting fired meant mission failure. Months of work burned. Evidence collection terminated. A surgeon free to continue stealing from wounded soldiers. Over the next 7 days, Elena watched the pattern evolve. Every time she flagged a billing inconsistency, and she was meticulous, photographing everything, uploading encrypted files to an Army intelligence server using her credentials, Pierce responded with another incident report. A write-up for inappropriate time spent with a single patient. A formal complaint about questioning physician orders without proper channels. Each complaint meticulously dated. Each one building a paper trail toward termination. Professional. Calculated. The work of a man who'd done this before. Brennan's chart showed something else. His cardiac status was declining. The echocardiogram from 3 days ago revealed fluid around his heart, a pericardial effusion that should have triggered immediate cardiology consultation. Instead, Pierce had ordered daily monitoring and nothing else. No intervention. No specialist. Just observation while pressure built around the muscle that kept the colonel alive. On day 8, the monitor alarm sounded during Elena's 10 p.m. rounds. The rhythm looked wrong. Fragmented. Dangerous. Brennan's blood pressure was dropping, 118/72. Then 115/71. Then 110/68. The downward slope was gentle but unmistakable. A sinking ship. Elena called for the charge nurse. I need cardiology consulted. Now. The charge nurse, Linda, 5 years younger, trained to follow protocol, nodded and called the operator. Paging cardiology. But that wasn't how it worked. Not anymore. 45 minutes later, Pierce appeared at the nurse's station. His face was composed. His voice was ice. Nurse Martinez, you do not consult specialists without attending physician approval. You flagged a concern, I evaluated it, and I determined that daily monitoring is sufficient. Your intervention was premature and medically unnecessary. He pulled out another incident report. Hand-wrote it right there in front of Linda. Nurse Martinez initiated specialist consultation without physician authorization, creating unnecessary costs and demonstrating continued boundary violations. He signed it, dated it, and slipped it into the formal complaints folder that was now at least 2 inches thick. Elena watched him turn and walk away. She could see Brennan's monitor in her peripheral vision. The numbers were still dropping. The pericardial effusion was still building. The pressure around his heart was still increasing, and nobody was going to help him because Pierce controlled the documentation, the billing, and every decision that mattered. That was the moment Elena understood what was actually happening. It wasn't just fraud. It was systematic neglect disguised as physician oversight. Pierce wasn't just stealing money. He was eliminating threats to his scheme, and he was using hospital policy to do it. Get rid of the nurse who notices. Get rid of the attention. Get rid of the accountability. The monitor alarm sounded again at 0:48. Brennan was in trouble, and for the first time in 14 years of combat medicine, Elena had no legal authority to help him. But that wasn't really true, was it? The pattern became impossible to ignore by Wednesday of that week. Elena would flag a billing discrepancy on Brennan's chart, phantom ICU charges, duplicate surgical codes, inflated anesthesia time, and within hours, Dr. Pierce would materialize with another incident report, each one dated and filed with the precision of a man building a case. 3 formal complaints in 14 days. Each one a fabrication. Each one another brick in the wall he was constructing to remove her before she saw the full scope of what was happening to the colonel's account. The math was simple: keep her distracted, keep her defensive, keep her from digging deeper. But Elena had spent 12 years reading patterns in combat zones where the difference between noticing small details and missing them meant the difference between a successful extraction and body bags. She noticed. By Friday, she'd photographed 47 pages of evidence with her phone camera during break shifts, the images stored in an encrypted folder labeled Medical Records Review that technically wasn't a lie. The fraud was systematic and staggering. Nearly $340,000 in charges that bore no correlation to actual procedures, all routed through Brennan's account because his medical record had become a perfect vector, a high-profile patient, catastrophic injuries, family stateside who didn't have time to audit every bill, insurance companies overwhelmed by legitimate trauma costs. It was theft dressed in medical language, and Dr. Pierce had been executing it with the precision of someone who'd been doing this for years. Elena documented it all. Then she waited. Waited for the right moment. Waited for Brennan to deteriorate in a way that would force the issue beyond bureaucracy and into the realm where survival mattered more than protocol. The night shift on Saturday started quiet. The kind of quiet that feels like held breath. Elena had been at Cedar Creek for 93 days now. She knew the rhythm of the hospital by heart, the midnight lull when the emergency department calmed, when the surgical floors emptied except for the night nurses making their rounds, when the only sound was the ventilator wheeze and the rhythmic beeping of monitors keeping people alive in the dark. She checked on Brennan at 10:02 p.m. during her regular vitals rotation. The colonel was asleep, his scarred forearm visible where the tattoo of her name ran in faded black ink. Elena, from a firefight he couldn't remember, a moment of rescue that had cost him his memory but saved his life. She was pulling up his vitals on the monitor when the numbers made her chest tighten. Heart rate 118. Should have been 72. Blood pressure 94/58 and dropping from his baseline of 118/74. His jugular veins distended against his neck like cables pulling taut. Classic signs. Unmistakable signs. Cardiac tamponade. The fluid around his heart was compressing it, strangling it, preventing it from filling properly. His body was screaming for help through numbers and physical exam findings that screamed louder than any alarm. Elena had seen this presentation before in the operating theaters at Bagram, had performed the procedure herself when soldiers came back from the field with shrapnel embedded in their chest cavities and minutes ticking down like a countdown timer. She knew what this looked like. She knew what it meant. She knew that without intervention in the next hour, Colonel James Brennan would suffer cardiac arrest. She paged the on-call attending immediately. Dr. Pierce answered on the second ring, his voice thick with irritation at being pulled from whatever he was doing. "This is Pierce. Colonel Brennan, room 412. Elevated heart rate, hypotensive, distended jugular veins." Elena kept her voice flat, clinical, stripped of anything that might sound emotional or reactive. Classic tamponade presentation. "He needs immediate evaluation." The silence on the other end lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then, anxiety response. Post-traumatic stress manifesting somatically. "I'm ordering at even 2 milligrams for push for sedation." "This is your pattern, Martinez. You create emergencies to justify." "With respect, doctor. Examine the patient yourself." It wasn't a request. It was an order dressed in deference, and both of them heard the difference. Elena had spent the last 3 months learning to speak in the voice the hospital expected, deferential, uncertain, always asking rather than stating. But underneath that performance was a woman who'd commanded a trauma surgical team in a war zone, who'd made life-and-death decisions in the space between heartbeats, who understood the weight of authority in a way that no amount of condescension could touch. She heard Pierce's breath shift on the phone. "I'm documenting refusal of consultation if you don't assess him," she added quietly. "Just so we're clear." 28 minutes later, Dr. Pierce arrived at room 412. He glanced at the monitor for perhaps 4 seconds, noted Brennan's distended neck veins with what looked like professional indifference, and shook his head with the certainty of a man who'd never once been wrong about anything in his life. Anxiety response. "I've seen this 100 times. Post-traumatic stress triggering sympathetic overload. I'm ordering at even and I'm adding this entire interaction to your disciplinary file. You're creating emergencies to justify your presence on this unit, and frankly, I'm recommending we discuss whether your nursing licensure is appropriate for this level of care." He didn't wait for a response. He simply turned and left, his footsteps echoing down the corridor with the sound of a man walking away from a problem he'd already solved by deciding it didn't exist. Elena watched him go. Then she checked the monitor again. Heart rate 124 now. Blood pressure 88/52. Brennan's breathing had taken on the shallow, rapid quality of a body in distress, his chest rising and falling like he was running a marathon while lying in bed. She sat down at the bedside and pulled his chart, noting Pierce's order for it even with the kind of clarity that comes from knowing exactly what the next few hours would require. Sedative. Exactly what a patient in cardiac tamponade did not need. Exactly what would push Brennan past the point of no return. By 11:54 p.m., his blood pressure had fallen to 82/46. His oxygen saturation was dropping despite the supplemental oxygen flowing through his nasal cannula. The monitor showed his heart rate climbing toward 140, his rhythm becoming irregular, the electrical signal of a heart being strangled by the fluid surrounding it, beating faster and faster in a desperate attempt to push blood through a system that was collapsing. Elena stood at his bedside, her hands moving through the checklist of what she could do without crossing into territory that would justify everything Pierce had been building toward. Oxygen, check. Positioning, check. Monitoring, check. Everything she was allowed to do, she had done. Everything that mattered, she could not do. The clock on the wall read 12:03 a.m. when Brennan's heart rate spiked to 156 and held there, his rhythm becoming unstable, his pressure dropping below 80. Elena pressed 2 fingers against the carotid artery in his neck and felt the fluttering there, the heart of a man drowning in his own chest cavity. She grabbed the crash cart phone and paged a code. Room for 12. Critical deterioration. All personnel respond. The monitor showed the exact moment his heart gave up trying. Ventricular fibrillation. The electrical chaos of a heart in complete failure, the rhythm that meant death in minutes without intervention. The alarm on the monitor screamed with the kind of sound that makes every nurse in the hospital move at once. But in the hallway outside room 412, something different happened. The footsteps slowed. The code team assembled, 7 doctors, all part of Dr. Pierce's surgical group, all moving with the kind of hesitation that meant they'd been told something. Elena watched them through the open door, saw their faces, saw the moment each one of them made a calculation that had nothing to do with medicine. Dr. Pierce's voice crackled over the intercom, calm and measured and absolutely certain. All physicians are advised that Nurse Martinez has a documented pattern of inappropriate code calls and protocol violations. Legal has flagged liability concerns with her patient management. I'm recommending we observe before intervening. No physician is to enter that room without my direct authorization. One by one, they step back. The first-year resident, Dr. Kim, froze by the crash cart, her face the color of bone. The attending cardiologist turned away. The two surgical residents, the interventional radiologist, the hospitalist, the intensivist, 7 doctors, each one making the decision to preserve their career over saving a life, each one walking backward down the hallway like they'd never made a conscious choice at all, just followed gravity toward the safest option. The monitor continued its urgent scream. Brennan's lips were turning blue. The electrical activity in his heart was collapsing from chaotic fibrillation into something worse, asystole, flatline, no electrical activity at all. The kind of rhythm that meant brain death was beginning, that the window for recovery was closing with every passing second. Elena had maybe 80 seconds. Maybe 90 if she was lucky. She made the calculation that every combat surgeon learns in the first hour of medical school: save the life now, deal with the consequences later. She pulled the trauma shears from her pocket, the ones engraved with her call sign on the handle, and began cutting through Brennan's gown. The monitor flatlined at 11:51 p.m. The heart rate display showed zeros and dashes. The alarm screamed its electronic wail through the intensive care unit. Elena's hand was already moving to the intercom button, her voice steady as bedrock. Code blue, bed 12. I need a surgical team now. Static crackled. Then Dr. Pierce's voice came back, clinical and cold. Nursing staff are not authorized to call codes on this patient. Stand down, Nurse Martinez. She didn't hesitate. Colonel Brennan is in cardiac arrest. He requires immediate. Liability concerns, Pierce interrupted. The protocol violations on this case are already documented. No surgical intervention without attending physician authorization. Elena was already moving to the crash cart, her hand steady as surgical steel. She pulled out the defibrillator pads, applied them to Brennan's chest. His rhythm remained flatline. Asystole. Dead. The intercom crackled again. This time it was different. 7 separate voices, all surgical residents from Pierce's team, all refusing. We're not responding to this code. Inappropriate nurse-initiated protocols. Scope of practice violation. Chart indicates supervising physician has declined intervention. One by one, they declined. 7 doctors. All walking away. All stepping back from a dying man because a superior officer had told them to fear the liability more than the death. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song above Brennan's body. Elena had perhaps 3 minutes before irreversible brain damage began. Before the man whose name was tattooed on her skin, whose life she had saved once before in a place where the ground shook from explosions, became nothing but a corpse that hospital administration could bury in paperwork. She made the calculation that every combat surgeon learns in the first hour of medical school: save the life now, deal with the consequences later. The trauma shears came from her pocket, stainless steel, engraved with her call sign on the handle, call sign she hadn't used in Denver until this moment. She cut through Brennan's gown in 2 precise strokes. The cotton fell away. His chest lay exposed, pale under the fluorescent lights, the ribs mapping out the anatomy she had memorized in a forward surgical team in Helmand Province 8 years ago. Dr. Kim, the resident who had been monitoring Brennan's vitals, stood frozen at the bedside, her face the color of bleached linen. Her hand shook. "Hold the retractor," Elena said. Not a request. A command. The same tone she'd used when shrapnel was flying and there was no time for politeness. "Exactly where I put it. Don't let go." Kim moved. Fear overrode hesitation. Elena's hands found the correct intercostal space between the 5th and 6th ribs. She cut through skin first, one smooth incision, the kind that comes from hands that have done this before, that have done it when bleeding out meant the difference between a recovery and a body bag. Muscle followed. Fascia parted beneath the blade. The scalpel moved with the certainty of muscle memory, the kind of reflex that lives in tendons and bone, not in conscious thought. Kim's breathing came in short gasps. Blood pooled in the thoracic cavity. Elena's hand went in, fingers finding the pericardium, the fluid-filled sac surrounding the heart. The tamponade. Brennan's blood had collected there, pressure building until the heart couldn't beat anymore. Classic, textbook, the kind of thing a cardiologist misses when they are not listening to a nurse's concerns. She opened the pericardium with precision. Fluid, serosanguinous, dark with blood, drained like a released breath. The pressure released. Elena's fingers found Brennan's heart muscle itself, still and cold under her palm, and began to massage it internally with steady compressions. Squeeze. Release. Squeeze. Release. The rhythm a meditation she had performed on 17 other soldiers in the dark hours of Bagram surgical teams. The monitor beeped once. Then again. Then found rhythm. The heart muscle firmed under her fingers, responding, remembering how to beat. Sinus rhythm established. Elena continued the internal massage for 30 more seconds, feeling the electrical impulses re-establish themselves in the tissue, feeling the muscle remember its purpose. The monitor showed 92 beats per minute. Oxygen saturation climbing. Blood pressure 118/76, climbing steadily. Brennan's color returned from ash-gray to something approaching human. For minutes. The entire procedure had taken 4 minutes. Elena closed the incision with rapid sutures, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. Needle through skin. Through fascia. Secure. Next. The closure was clean, economical, the kind of suturing that speaks of thousands of hours in operating rooms and field conditions where wasting motion meant bleeding out. Kim stared at her with something between horror and awe, still holding the retractor exactly where Elena had placed it. That was, where did you learn? Step back, Elena said quietly. Call the surgical team. Tell them Colonel Brennan is stable and requires proper post-operative monitoring. The hospital intercom crackled to life again, but this time it wasn't Pierce's voice. It was the automated operator. Dr. Pierce, you have an urgent call from hospital administration. Dr. Pierce to the administrator's office immediately. Elena finished the last suture. Brennan's monitors showed strong and steady vitals. His chest rose and fell with mechanical ventilation, his heart beating through its own rhythm now, not through her fingers. The bleeding had stopped. The tamponade had drained. The impossible had become the done. That was when the doors to the ICU burst open. Dr. Pierce arrived exactly 20 minutes after the code began, flanked by 2 security guards whose uniforms hung like threats. But it was the folder Pierce carried that spoke louder than any uniform. 6 inches thick. Incident reports. Policy violation documentation. Written in triplicate. His face was the color of old mahogany, his jaw muscles working as he processed what he was seeing, Brennan alive. Brennan's monitors steady. Brennan's chest rising and falling with the telltale signs of post-operative recovery. The thoracotomy incision fresh and sutured and wrong, all impossible, all executed by the nurse he'd been systematically destroying for 3 weeks. Nurse Martinez, Pierce said, his voice tight and controlled in a way that made it more dangerous than any shout. You are terminated effective immediately. Unauthorized surgical procedure. Scope of practice violation. Endangering patient safety through procedural deviation. The administrator nodded grimly, looking everywhere except at Elena's face. Elena stripped off her latex gloves. The silence that followed was the kind that lives in hospital rooms when something fundamental has shifted and everyone knows it but nobody can yet articulate what. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song. Somewhere down the corridor, a ventilator wheezed. The sounds of Cedar Creek Medical continuing on, indifferent. She removed her badge from her pocket, the one with her civilian name, the name that wasn't Captain, the identity that had been carefully constructed for 18 months of being underestimated. She placed it on the desk beside Brennan's bed. "Understood, Dr. Pierce," she said, her voice exactly level, exactly composed, the voice of a woman who had just cracked open a man's chest and saved his life and was being fired for it. She turned to the security guards. "I'm ready." The walk to the locker room was interminable. 78 steps, she counted them, the way soldiers count steps as a way to maintain discipline when everything else is fracturing. The locker room was empty at midnight. The fluorescent lights cast everything in sickly green. She opened locker 247, the one she'd used for 18 months, and pulled out her civilian clothes, the jeans and hoodie she'd worn before the shift, the life that wasn't military, the identity that had been temporary. Her belongings fit into a single cardboard box. Stethoscope. 2 pairs of compression socks. A photograph of Miguel from his school basketball team. The faded unit patch she kept tucked inside her jacket lining, the one with her old unit designation embroidered in gold thread, the one that proved who she actually was. She pulled the box to her chest and walked toward the exit. Security escorted her through the corridors of Cedar Creek Medical. Nurses looked up from their stations. Residents stepped aside. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The message was clear. They had seen what happened to people who challenged Dr. Pierce, and they had decided that caution was safer than conscience. The parking lot was empty and rain-slicked, the kind of Denver night in November where the cold hits like a blade. Elena walked to her car, a nondescript sedan registered to a civilian alias, and placed the cardboard box on the passenger seat. She sat in the driver's seat for approximately 40 seconds. Then she started the engine and drove. The drive home took 23 minutes. She took every light on green, moved through the empty streets like a ghost, and found herself at her apartment complex at 2:07 a.m. The place was dark except for the porch light Miguel had left on, the way he always did when she was working night shifts, his signal that he was safe inside, waiting. She let herself in. The apartment smelled like her son's basketball shoes and the Thai food they'd ordered the night before. She walked to the kitchen table, the same table where they'd done homework for 8 years, where she pretended to be a normal nurse with a normal life, and she sat down. Elena Martinez placed her face in her hands. The shaking started in her shoulders, silent and overwhelming, the kind of breakdown that only comes after months of stoic control, after 18 months of being underestimated and insulted and documented and defamed, after 4 minutes of performing surgery at a bedside while 7 doctors refused to help. The trembling wasn't fear. It was the release of all the restraint. She sat alone in the dark kitchen at 2:07 a.m. and allowed herself to break, knowing that if she didn't break now, she might never fit back together again. That was how Miguel found her at 5:43 a.m. when his alarm went off for school. He walked into the kitchen to get his breakfast, backpack over one shoulder, still half asleep, and stopped. Mom was still in her scrubs from the night shift. Mom's shoulders were shaking. Mom's face was hidden in her hands. Mom was crying, actually crying, the first time in his 14 years that he had ever seen her break. He didn't ask questions. He set down his backpack and sat beside her and waited for her to speak. 2 in the morning. The parking lot of Cedar Creek Medical was empty except for Elena's Subaru, rain hammering the windshield like applause for something she'd just destroyed. She sat in the driver's seat for 20 minutes before turning the key, watching the hospital lights blur through the wet glass. Inside her jacket, her hospital ID badge was gone. Security had taken it during checkout, their hands careful but firm, the way you'd handle evidence. She'd cleaned out her locker in 7 minutes. Everything that mattered fit in a single cardboard box, a container of protein powder, 2 pairs of compression socks, a photo of Miguel from his 6th grade graduation taped inside the door. The drive home to her apartment took 17 minutes. She didn't stop at lights. She didn't slow for rain. By the time she reached the kitchen table, her hands had stopped shaking, but the rest of her hadn't caught up yet, her shoulders moving in a rhythm that felt like someone else's breathing, her face pressed against her palms because if she looked up she'd have to see the empty apartment, the walls that had witnessed every decision that led to this moment, and the absolute certainty that she'd thrown away her assignment, her cover, her future, all because a man's heart had stopped and seven doctors had chosen liability over humanity. The tears came anyway. She sat at that kitchen table for 2 hours without moving, and when Miguel found her there at 6:30 in the morning, still in her scrubs, still in her coat, he didn't ask questions. He set down his backpack and sat beside her and waited for her to speak. "I got fired," she said finally, and those 3 words cost her something she couldn't name. Miguel was 14 years old and had spent his entire life watching his mother hold everything together with the kind of precision that made disasters look like maintenance schedules. He'd never seen her cry. Not when his father left. Not when her deployment orders came through. Not when she came home with a purple heart and the kind of 1,000-yard stare that meant she'd seen the worst the world had to offer and decided to stand in front of it anyway. But he recognized the shape of it now, not weakness, but the moment when carrying the weight alone became heavier than asking for help. "What happened?" he asked. "I did my job," Elena said. That's what happened. That afternoon, Miguel did something his mother never would have done. He went to her bedroom and opened the cedar chest at the foot of her bed, the one she'd told him never to touch, and inside, wrapped in acid-free tissue, were 3 things that explained his mother in a way nothing else ever could. A silver star citation with her photograph, eyes forward, expression carved from granite. A bronze star with velar device, the ribbon faded from storage but the medal itself catching light like captured lightning. A combat medical badge. And he took them, still in their shadow box, and he walked to Cedar Creek Medical in his school uniform and pushed past the front desk because his mother had always moved through the world with the kind of authority that nobody questioned, and he was learning how to do the same. The hospital board meeting was happening in conference room B on the 4th floor. Miguel knew this because he'd asked. The security guard had started to stop him, and Miguel had simply said, "My mother works here. Captain Elena Martinez. ICU." The tone made it sound like she hadn't just been fired. The tone made it sound like she owned the building. In conference room B, Dr. Pierce was standing at the head of a mahogany table explaining why Elena's intervention had constituted gross negligence, why her unauthorized access to billing records was a HIPAA violation, why the hospital had no choice but to terminate her effective immediately. The state medical inspector, a man named Walsh who specialized in fraud investigation, was taking notes. The hospital administrator looked like someone waiting for the guillotine to fall. Miguel pushed open the door without knocking and set the shadow box on the table. "You need to see these," he said. 14 years old, voice steady, carrying a weight that should have crushed him but instead straightened his spine. Dr. Pierce's face went the color of spoiled milk. The inspector picked up the shadow box and read the citations aloud, slowly, the way you'd read the charges against someone in a courtroom. Captain Elena Martinez, for extraordinary heroism while serving as trauma surgeon, sustained enemy fire, saved 12 lives including one Colonel James Brennan, for which service she is hereby awarded the Silver Star, the Bronze Star with velar device, the Combat Medical Badge. He looked at Miguel. "You're her son?" "Yes, sir," Miguel said. "How old are you?" 14. "And you brought these?" She didn't. "So I did." The hospital administrator's face had shifted from pale to something like realization, the kind that comes when you suddenly understand you've been on the wrong side of a story you didn't know you were in. Pierce was trying to interrupt, trying to redirect, trying to explain that military credentials were irrelevant to hospital protocol, when Colonel Brennan's attending Marine Corps liaison, a major named Holloway who'd been observing the investigation, stood up and pulled a photograph from his briefcase and set it down on the table in front of Walsh. It was the photograph that Dr. Kim had taken during Brennan's Code Blue. Elena's hands inside a chest cavity that had been closed less than 8 hours earlier, her face focused with the kind of concentration that only comes when you've done something 100 times before, her body positioned with the muscle memory of someone for whom trauma surgery wasn't a procedure, it was a language. "That's the unauthorized intervention," Holloway said quietly. "That's the protocol violation. That's the woman you just fired while 7 of your colleagues stood in a hallway and let a patient code blue without responding." The state inspector was reading the metadata timestamp on the photograph. His eyes moved to the clock on the wall, then to the notes in front of him about the timeline of the code. He said nothing. He simply opened his laptop and pulled up the audit trail that Elena, operating with the precision of someone trained in intelligence work, had flagged in Brennan's billing records over the past 2 months. Dr. Pierce, Walsh said slowly, his voice dropping into the register that prosecutors use when they've already won and are just waiting for the defendant to realize it, I'd like to discuss some of these billing charges. Specifically, these ICU equipment fees from MedSupply Corporation. That's the company your brother-in-law owns, correct? The one that's billed this hospital $847,000 in phantom charges over the past 3 years. The conference room went so quiet you could hear the hospital's ventilation system humming in the walls. Pierce's mouth opened. Closed. His right hand gripped the edge of the table with the kind of force that made his knuckles white. This is irrelevant, he said. This is a witch hunt designed to distract from the fact that Captain Martinez, and yes, I see now that she's military, engaged in unsanctioned medical intervention outside her scope of practice. She's a trauma surgeon, the Pentagon general said. Everyone turned. He'd been sitting in the corner, civilian clothes, no name tag, just a man who'd arrived that morning with the Marine Corps liaison and had been quietly observing the entire proceeding. When he stood up, something about the way the air pressure changed made it clear that this was someone accustomed to authority the way Elena was accustomed to saving lives, like oxygen, like gravity, like the force that held the world in its proper shape. Captain Elena Martinez graduated from the Johns Hopkins Trauma Surgery Program, the general continued, then completed advanced combat surgical certification through the Army Medical Department. She's performed 247 emergency thoracotomies. She's saved the lives of 43 soldiers, including one Colonel James Brennan, who was her patient at Bagram Airfield and is currently her patient at this hospital. She performed yesterday's thoracotomy because 7 doctors chose litigation insurance over their Hippocratic oaths. If you're going to accuse her of being unqualified, you're going to have to argue with me. The general made a phone call. It took approximately 4 minutes. Within the hour, 2 Army Criminal Investigation Division officers arrived with a federal fraud warrant. They escorted Pierce to a conference room, then to his car, then, after preliminary charges were filed, to a criminal defense attorney's office where the lawyer took one look at the evidence and started negotiating a plea agreement. The irony was perfect, the kind of thing that makes the universe feel like it has a sense of justice. Pierce's own submission of documents to destroy Elena had instead created a perfect paper trail of his own fraud. Every inflated equipment charge, every phantom ICU fee, every supply order that never arrived, it was all documented in the files he'd submitted to prove Elena's unauthorized access to financial records. He'd built the case against himself with the meticulous precision of someone who'd never imagined the evidence could be turned around. But that wasn't the worst part for him. The worst part came 6 months later, after his medical license was permanently revoked, after his pension was seized for veteran restitution, after every hospital in the state received a notice that Dr. Stephen Pierce would no longer be permitted to practice medicine. The worst part was that Elena walked back into Cedar Creek Medical with a promotion, a formal apology, and 7 standing ovations from the staff he'd tried to cow into silence. The worst part was that he was teaching CPR to teenagers at Denver Community College for $12 an hour, demonstrating chest compressions on a plastic dummy that didn't have his brother-in-law's connections or his country club memberships or the kind of institutional power that comes from knowing how to weaponize bureaucracy. Miguel sat in one of Pierce's classes one afternoon, just observing, just watching the man who'd tried to destroy his mother explain the proper hand position for cardiopulmonary resuscitation to a room full of bored kids who had no idea they were looking at a cautionary tale. Pierce didn't recognize Miguel. Why would he? But Miguel recorded the whole thing on his phone and sent it to Elena with one message: he looks smaller now. That evening, Elena stood in the auditorium of Cedar Creek Medical wearing her full dress uniform, captain's bars polished bright, and Colonel James Brennan, walking with a cane but walking, his right arm still weak from the stroke that his cardiac tamponade had almost caused, his eyes clear because someone had saved his life when it would have been easier to let him die, pinned the Meritorious Service Medal on her chest. For exceptional service in the protection and care of wounded service members, Brennan said, his voice carrying the formal precision of military protocol, both in combat and in continuation of that mission in civilian settings. Captain Elena Martinez, accept this medal and the gratitude of the Army, the Marine Corps, and this patient, who carries your name on his skin and your actions in his heart. The audience, doctors, nurses, residents, hospital administrators, a state medical inspector, and a Pentagon general, applauded with the kind of force that made the walls seem to vibrate. Miguel recorded it from the front row, and for once, his mother didn't look uncomfortable with the recognition. She accepted it the way she did everything else, with composure, with grace, with the absolute certainty of someone who'd already won the fight that mattered. Elena stepped to the microphone. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together, she said simply, looking directly at the nursing staff who'd kept their heads down through Pierce's reign. Sometimes strength looks like showing up, doing the work, and trusting that truth finds its way to the surface. Thank you for witnessing that. Thank you for standing with me. She touched the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, still there, still hidden, because some things don't need display to matter. Brennan saluted. The general saluted. The room filled with the sound of hands coming together in recognition, in apology, in the kind of acknowledgement that comes too late but arrives nonetheless. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your strength, subscribe to the channel and tell us your story. Like this video. Comment below. Because the quietest people in our lives are often carrying the heaviest loads. And sometimes they need us to see it.